In this module, we're going to go through a series of topics about how the nervous system works. We're going to start by talking about the structure of the nervous system. We're then going to discuss how the neuron, the building block of the nervous system, operates. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about the structure and function of the brain, and specifically what some of the interesting things are that happen when brain damage occurs. Let's start out by talking about the structure of the nervous system. The nervous system has two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and that is the part of the nervous system that we're going to be spending most of our time on because from a psychological point of view, it's the most interesting part. But the other part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. This is everything in the nervous system outside of the brain and the spinal cord. Now we can divide the peripheral nervous system up into several other categories: the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's responsible for voluntary movement. So if you decide to stand up and walk to the kitchen and get a snack in the middle of this slideshow, you are voluntarily, consciously making certain muscles in your body move so that that can happen. And it's your somatic nervous system that's responsible for doing that. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, is the part of the nervous system that controls involuntary things. So if somebody set off a firecracker behind you or slammed a door and you jumped and startled and adrenaline started racing through your system, that's all your autonomic nervous system in operation. The autonomic nervous system is the thing that stimulates the adrenal gland and all of the other endocrine systems in the body. And that can be divided up into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Sympathetic is the part of the nervous system that revs you up. It energizes you. It excites you. It arouses you. It kicks in the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system responsible for calming you back down to your baseline level of arousal. Here's another slide. It shows you essentially the same thing, but down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see two other boxes, sensory and motor nerves. There are separate pathways in the nervous system. One carries information from the brain down to the muscles and allows you to move. The other carries information from the sense organs back up to the brain so you can process that information. The essential building block of the entire nervous system are the nerve cells, and a nerve cell is called a neuron. Whenever you see a picture of a neuron, it looks almost exactly like the one that you're looking at here. This is the type of neuron that neuroscientists usually work with. This is what a motor neuron looks like. They're the neurons responsible for making your muscles move. They're the largest neurons, and therefore they're the easiest ones to see and work with. Neurons have many different shapes, and I'll get to that in a moment. But all neurons have the same essential features. If you look at the left side of the screen, you'll notice that there's a cell body. This has a nucleus and ribosomes and all of the other things that any other cell in your body would have. One thing that makes neurons a little different, though, is if you look at the cell body, you'll see these little fingery, like tree limb things sticking out. These are called dendrites, and they receive information from other neurons, and we'll talk about those in a little more detail soon. The long, snaky part of the cell is called the axon. It's a long fiber that stretches from one end to the other, and the axon is covered in a sheet of something called myelin, which protects it. And at the far end of the axon, you see these little buttons that are known as axon terminals. We're going to come back and look at each part of the neuron in much more detail in the coming slides. Neurons aren't the only kinds of cells in the nervous system. There are cells that are known as glial cells, and they kind of protect and nurture the neurons and protect them and sort of clean out the trash. So there are other cells in the nervous system, but the nerve cell, the neuron, is the thing that makes things happen. This slide illustrates all of the different forms that neurons can take. And as you can see, they're very different from each other. Some of them are long and thin. Others are very bushy. They look like tumbleweeds almost. And neurons interconnect with other neurons in very complicated ways. So neurons exist in networks. And it's these bundles of neurons that are in communication with each other that we believe are the foundation for things like memories and different cognitive processes that we'll be considering later in the course. So neurons branch and grow and connect all throughout the nervous system. But how do they actually operate? Spend a little time looking at this diagram, and I want you to pay attention to a few things. On the far right, you'll see these little colored circles coming in and hitting the dendrites. The dendrites are those wispy antenna-like things on the coming out of the cell body. And after those dendrites absorb those little dots that I'll talk about in a moment, you'll notice this traveling wave that goes down the length of the axon. And at the other end of the neuron, you see the release of other little red circles. This entire process is something called the action potential. Most of the time, we just talk about a neuron firing. And firing is kind of the slang term for the action potential. The action potential is the reason everything happens in the nervous system. An action potential is an all or nothing process. A neuron either fires or it doesn't. There's no such thing as a weak action potential versus a strong action potential. An action potential is an action potential. It's like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. Now, how does the action potential actually take place? When the cell fires, what happens is these little gates open up and all the positively charged sodium ions rush into the cell. And they rush into the cell faster than the other positively charged ions in the cell, potassium ions, rush out. And so what used to be positive on the outside and negative on the inside for a very brief period of time suddenly becomes very positively charged inside the cell because of all the positive sodium ions that raced in. And this creates something called depolarization. There's a flip-flop in the electrical charges so that the formerly negative inside of the cell is now positive and vice versa. And this travels as an electrochemical charge down the length of the axon. Now, I want you to know that the firing of a neuron, that an action potential, is the result of an electrochemical process. I will not ask you about positive and negative charges. I will not ask you for the names of any of the ions, but I do want you to know the fundamental process that's going on. So right after a neuron fires, there's a period of time known as the refractory period where the neuron cannot fire again. And during this period of time, the chemicals are being pumped back to their proper places. The sodium ions are being pumped back to the outside of the cell, and the potassium ions are being sucked back to the inside of the cell. And when the cell gets back to its normal resting state, it's ready to fire again. Now the question is, how does this firing take place? What is the thing that triggers the action potential? Let's zoom in, and in this diagram you can see the little area in the box that shows what we're zooming in on. It's where the terminal buttons of one neuron are coming near the dendrites of another neuron. Now these cells don't actually touch each other. there's a little space in between these cells, and this space is called the synapse. And in this picture, you can see these little circles full of small dots. Those are holding something called a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the substance that cause communication in the nervous system to happen. So when a neuron fires, it releases a neurotransmitter into the synapse, and other neurons will take up that neurotransmitter, which causes them to fire. So the message gets passed along from neuron to neuron to neuron, and that's how information travels through the nervous system. Now, there are many different kinds of neurotransmitters, and we don't even really know how many of them there are, certainly in the hundreds. But all neurons don't respond to all neurotransmitters. Think of this like a lock and a key. All right, you have a lot of keys in your life probably. You have a key to your dorm room, a key to your house, a key to your car. And that key is designed to fit one particular lock. You can't take your car key and open your dorm room with it. You can't take your car key, I hope, and start my car with it or open my office door. The key is designed to fit a very specific lock. Neurons and neurotransmitters operate like locks and keys. Neurons release certain neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters float around looking for dendrites that match them. They're looking for other neurons that are sensitive to those particular neurotransmitters. And a neuron will not fire unless it has been exposed to just the right neurotransmitter. Just as a lock will not open unless it meets the right key. Now, there are a lot of different neurotransmitters, and in the chapter of the textbook, you'll be reading about a lot of them and what they do. And here's a list of some of the most common names and some of the ones you'll run into in the textbook. I promise I will not ask you any questions on the quiz about specific neurotransmitters. I want you to know what a neurotransmitter is. It's the chemical substance that gets released into the synapse that stimulates other neurons. But I'm not going to ask you about specific neurotransmitters. Also keep in mind that the message that neurotransmitters carry can be inhibitory or excitatory. In other words, the message from the neuron could be fire. They want the action potential to occur, but sometimes the message is inhibitory. The neurotransmitter that is being taken up is signaling the cell that it should not fire. So neurotransmitter messages can be a little more complicated than it seems, and your textbook gets into a lot of detail about that. So on the quiz, I certainly am going to ask you some basic questions about what neurons are, how they work, what the parts of them are, but I will not ask you about the chemicals that are involved in the action potential, and I will not ask you about specific neurotransmitters, just about neurotransmitters in general. A section of Chapter 3 in your textbook is devoted to drugs and how they work. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I don't have much to add to what the book has to say, but I do want you to study that part of the book and know about drugs. But a short answer to the question, how do drugs work, is that they work through the nervous system by messing with how neurotransmitters operate. Some drugs mimic certain neurotransmitters and it's kind of like a fake key that fits the hole in the lock and therefore will open the door. They impersonate neurotransmitters. Some drugs interfere with the uptake of neurotransmitters and prevent neurons from firing when ordinarily they would. So different drugs work in different ways and have obviously different effects. And when I'm talking about drugs here, I'm talking about recreational drugs like marijuana and LSD. I'm talking about hardcore addictive drugs like heroin. And I'm also talking about your over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, ibuprofen and aspirin and so on. All of these operate through the nervous system by messing with brain chemistry. So be sure to read that part of the chapter. I think you'll find it interesting.